My name is Dalia Reyes. I'm 36 years old, and 5 weeks ago, at my nephew's confirmation lunch, my sister Camille told 14 relatives, including our godmother, that I'd basically abandoned Dad the second he went into the nursing home, and that she was the only one who actually shows up for him anymore. She didn't know that 3 weeks earlier I'd requested the official visitor log from Sunrise Manor Care Center, and that it showed my name signed in 312 times over the 2.5 years our father has lived there, more than anyone else in our family combined. I didn't argue with her at that lunch. I just finished my iced tea, thanked our host, and drove home knowing exactly what was sitting in a folder on my kitchen counter. To understand why I stayed so calm, you need to go back 2.5 years, to the hardest phone call of my adult life, and the quiet decision I made afterward that nobody in my family ever noticed enough to ask about. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word "showed up" in the comments if you've ever done the hard, unglamorous work of caring for someone while somebody else got the credit for caring more. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that lunch makes sense. Our father, Ernesto Reyes, is 79, a retired postal worker who raised Camille and me mostly on his own after our mother passed when I was 11. He worked the same mail route in our neighborhood in Sacramento for nearly 30 years, the kind of job where half the block knew him by name, and I still run into former neighbors occasionally who ask after him fondly, remembering him as the mailman who always had a piece of candy in his pocket for kids waiting at the bus stop. 2.5 years ago, after a series of falls and a diagnosis of moderate vascular dementia, his doctor told us plainly that he could no longer safely live alone, and after weeks of difficult conversations, Camille and I made the decision together to move him into Sunrise Manor, a mid-sized care facility about 20 minutes from my apartment, and closer to 45 minutes from Camille's house across town. I want to be fair to my sister here, because I don't think she's a villain in this story, even after what she said at that lunch. Camille has 2 young kids, a demanding job as a regional sales manager that involves frequent travel, and a genuinely full plate. I'm single, work as a paralegal with a schedule that's flexible enough to allow evening visits most days of the week, and I live close enough to Sunrise Manor that stopping by on my way home from work has never required much more than a slight detour. Our circumstances were never equal, and I don't think either of us fully reckoned with what that would mean once Dad actually moved in. The decision to move him into care at all was its own difficult chapter, one I don't think either of us has fully processed even now. Dad fought the idea hard at first, insisting he was fine, that he just needed to write more notes to himself, that the falls were bad luck rather than a pattern. I remember sitting with him at his kitchen table the week before the move, watching him look around at the house he and our mother had bought together, running his hand over the same worn spot on the tablecloth he'd run his hand over 1,000 times before, and understanding, for the first time really, that we were asking him to leave behind more than just a building. Camille handled the logistics of that transition well. I want to be clear about that. She researched facilities, compared costs, handled the insurance paperwork, real and substantial work that I don't want to minimize just because it happened before the story I'm about to tell. The first few months were the hardest. Dad's dementia made the transition disorienting for him. He'd sometimes forget where he was, ask repeatedly when he was going home, and on his worst days, not recognize the room he'd been sleeping in for weeks. I started visiting almost every evening after work, partly because the staff mentioned that a familiar face in the early evening seemed to ease his agitation before bedtime, and partly because I simply couldn't stand the thought of him sitting alone in an unfamiliar place feeling forgotten. I never made a formal decision to visit that often. It just became the shape of my evenings, the way some habits form without you consciously choosing them. Dinner, dishes, the 20-minute drive to Sunrise Manor, an hour or two with Dad, home by 9. Camille visited too, especially in those early months, though less frequently. Sunday afternoons mostly, sometimes bringing the kids, which Dad genuinely loved, since his grandchildren were often the only people who could reliably make him laugh on a hard day. I don't want to erase that. Camille's visits mattered to him, and I never once resented the fact that her visits looked different from mine, shaped by a life with far more competing demands than my own. What I didn't expect, over those 2.5 years, was how the story of who takes care of Dad would come to be told so differently from what I was actually seeing happen. Camille, I think without fully realizing it, began describing her Sunday visits at family gatherings in language that made them sound like the primary thread holding Dad's care together. "I try to get out there every week," she'd say. Technically true, but incomplete, in a way that let people assume, without her ever quite lying outright, that weekly visits represented the bulk of what Dad's care actually looked like. My evening visits, 5 and sometimes 6 nights a week, rarely came up in conversation at all, partly because I never thought to mention them, and partly, I think, because unglamorous consistency doesn't make for compelling dinner conversation, the way a dramatic Sunday outing with the grandkids does. I want to be honest that I bear some responsibility for that imbalance too. I could have mentioned my visits more often, could have made them more visible, and chose instead to simply keep showing up quietly, assuming, wrongly as it turned out, that the truth of a situation eventually announces itself without anyone needing to say it out loud. I didn't correct the narrative for a long time. I told myself it didn't matter who got credit, as long as Dad was cared for, which felt like the genuinely important thing. That belief held up reasonably well until roughly a year ago, when small comments started creeping into family conversations. Camille mentioning at a birthday dinner that she worried I was pulling away from the family, without any specific incident to point to, or telling our aunt that she wished I visited more, phrased vaguely enough that I initially assumed she simply didn't realize how often I actually went. I corrected her gently, a few times, mentioning that I visited most evenings, and each time she seemed to brush past it quickly, moving the conversation elsewhere, in a way that started to feel less like genuine misunderstanding and more like something she'd simply decided not to absorb. The comment that finally made me start paying closer attention came about 4 months ago, at a smaller family dinner, when Camille told our uncle in front of me that she'd been handling most of the emotional labor of Dad's care while I'd kind of checked out once the hard decisions were made. I remember sitting there, genuinely stunned, trying to reconcile that sentence with the 300-plus evenings I'd spent in that facility over the previous 2 years, helping him with dinner, walking him down the hallway when his legs were stiff, sitting with him through confused, frightened moments that I'd never once described to anyone in detail because they felt too private, too painful to turn into dinner conversation. The nights he cried because he couldn't remember our mother's face clearly anymore. The nights he asked me, calmly and matter-of-factly, whether he was going to die alone in that building. Questions I answered as gently as I could manage, while my own chest tightened with a grief I never quite found the words to share with anyone else in the family. I didn't confront her that night either. I want to be honest about why. Part of me still believed, stubbornly, that the truth of who showed up would simply become obvious over time, without me needing to argue for it. Part of me also didn't want to turn my father's care into a competition, which felt like exactly the wrong thing to do to a situation that was hard enough already. What changed my mind wasn't Camille at all, actually. It was a conversation with one of Sunrise Manor's evening nurses, a woman named Fatima who'd worked the same shift for most of the 2.5 years Dad had lived there, and who mentioned, almost in passing one evening, "You know, the other residents' families always ask me how you manage to come so often. I always tell them you're basically part of our evening routine at this point. That comment stayed with me for days. It occurred to me, slowly, that there was an actual objective record of exactly how often I'd shown up, not a memory that could be reshaped by whoever told the story most confidently, but a literal sign-in log that every visitor at Sunrise Manor is required to complete at the front desk, listing their name, the date, and their time of arrival and departure. Standard practice at most care facilities, both for security purposes and to help staff track patient engagement and social contact, which matters clinically for residents with cognitive decline. I'd signed that log myself, almost without thinking about it, hundreds of times over 2.5 years, usually barely glancing at the clipboard on my way past the front desk, my handwriting getting progressively worse the later in the evening I arrived. I called the facility's administrator, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Deborah Whitfield, and asked whether family members could request a copy of a resident's visitor log for their own records. She explained that as an authorized family contact already listed on Dad's file, I could request it without much difficulty, since it wasn't protected health information in the way his actual medical records were. It was simply a facility security and engagement log, something families sometimes requested for exactly the reason I was asking: to have a factual record of visitation patterns, occasionally for legal or care planning purposes, or sometimes, she mentioned gently, for exactly the kind of family disagreement I was clearly navigating, though she was too professional to ask directly. I filled out a short request form, and about 10 days later, Deborah handed me a printed spreadsheet at the front desk, several pages long, organized by date. I sat in my car in the parking lot, before I even started the engine, scanning down the columns. My name appeared, by my own count when I got home, and actually tallied it carefully that evening at my kitchen table, with a highlighter and a legal pad, 312 times across 2.5 years, an average of roughly 4 to 5 visits a week, consistent with almost no gaps longer than a few days, aside from a single 10-day stretch when I'd had the flu badly enough that Fatima had actually called to check on me, worried by my sudden absence. I remember laughing a little, sitting there at my kitchen table, at how strange it felt to be quantifying something that had never once felt like a project or an obligation, just the ordinary shape of my evenings for 2.5 years. Camille's name appeared, by contrast, 31 times over the same period, genuine visits, real time spent with Dad, but a fraction, by any honest measure, of what I'd been quietly doing almost every single evening without ever thinking to document or announce it. I didn't bring the log to that family dinner where Camille made her comment about emotional labor. I sat with it for weeks, uncertain what, if anything, I wanted to do with it, mostly hoping, I think, that simply knowing the truth privately would be enough to settle something in me, even if nobody else ever found out. What finally pushed me was my nephew's confirmation lunch, 5 weeks ago. A warm, crowded gathering at my aunt's house with folding tables set up in the backyard and a cake shaped like a cross that my nephew had picked out himself. Camille, standing near the dessert table with our godmother and several cousins, mid-conversation about how difficult the past couple years had been for the whole family, said the sentence I opened this story with, that I'd basically abandoned Dad the moment he went into the nursing home, and that she was the only one who actually still showed up for him. I want to describe the specific feeling of hearing that because I think it matters. It wasn't quite anger, not in that first moment. It was something closer to a strange, disorienting vertigo, the sensation of hearing a completely different version of your own life described confidently, in public, by someone who apparently believed it. I remember looking down at my plate, at a half-eaten piece of that cross-shaped cake, and feeling genuinely unsure, for a second, whether I'd somehow misremembered 2.5 years of my own evenings. Our godmother glanced at me sympathetically, clearly uncertain whether to say anything. My cousin Priya, standing nearby, told me later she'd almost said something in the moment, but hadn't wanted to make a scene at a kid's confirmation lunch. I finished my iced tea, thanked our hosts, and left not long after, driving home with the specific, quiet resolve of someone who'd finally run out of patience for waiting to be noticed. I called Camille the next morning, not to ambush her the way I could have publicly at that lunch, but because I wanted an actual conversation rather than another moment where the loudest version of events simply won by default. I told her plainly that I'd requested Sunrise Manor's visitor log 3 weeks earlier, that my name appeared on it 312 times over 2.5 years compared to her 31, and that I needed her to understand exactly how far her comment at the lunch had been from the truth. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. 312, she finally repeated quietly. That can't be right. It's an actual printed log from the front desk, Camille. I can send you a copy if you want to see it yourself. I didn't realize it was that many, she said, her voice smaller now than it had been at the lunch. I don't know what I thought. I think I just needed to believe I was doing enough, and it was easier to tell myself I was doing more than I actually was, than to sit with how little time I've genuinely had for him these past couple years. I told her I understood that her life was full in ways mine wasn't, and that I'd never once expected her visits to match mine in frequency. What I needed, I said, was for you to stop telling people I abandoned him, when the actual record shows the opposite of that. You can be busy and still be honest about who's actually been showing up. I think I've been carrying a lot of guilt about not visiting more, she said after a pause. And somewhere along the way, it got easier to turn that guilt outward, onto you, instead of just sitting with it myself. That's not fair to you, I know that, even as I'm saying it. I appreciated her saying that more than I let on in the moment. I told her I didn't need her to feel worse about her own limitations. Kids and a demanding job are real constraints, not moral failures. I just needed the story about who'd actually been present to reflect what had genuinely happened. She apologized, quietly, and asked if she could see the log for herself. I emailed her a scanned copy that afternoon. She called me back 2 days later, her voice different, more subdued than I'd heard it in a long time. I sat with it for a while, she said. I think some part of me knew, honestly, that I wasn't visiting as much as I used to tell people I was. It was easier to believe my own version than to actually look at it directly. Seeing your name 312 times and mine 31, I don't know how to feel about that if I'm honest. Ashamed, mostly. I don't need you ashamed, I told her. I just need it to stop being a competition where I'm somehow losing, when the record shows I've been the one showing up almost every single night. You're right, she said. I'm sorry. I mean that. 5 weeks have passed since that lunch. Camille has started visiting more consistently, not every evening the way I do, which was never realistic given her circumstances, but genuinely more often, roughly twice a week now instead of the occasional Sunday it had drifted into. She told our godmother, at a small gathering 2 weeks ago, a corrected version of events, mentioning plainly that I'd been the one visiting almost daily throughout Dad's time at Sunrise Manor. A small, quiet correction that meant more to me than I expected it to. She's also started texting me after her own visits now, small updates. Dad seemed good today, we talked about the old house. A habit that's slowly rebuilding something between us that had quietly eroded over the past year, without either of us fully naming it, until the log made it impossible to ignore. Fatima, the evening nurse, mentioned to me a couple weeks ago, unprompted, that she'd noticed Camille visiting more often lately, and said something I've thought about since. It's good when families figure this stuff out while the person's still here to benefit from it, she said. I've seen families sort it out too late, after someone's already passed, and by then it's just regret with nowhere to go. I told her I appreciated her saying that, and that I hoped we'd genuinely figured it out in time, rather than simply patched over a disagreement for a few weeks before it faded back into old patterns. Dad doesn't fully track any of this the way we do. His dementia has progressed enough that he doesn't always remember which of us visited yesterday, let alone keep a running tally of years. But there are good evenings, more often than not, where he recognizes me immediately, reaches for my hand, and asks about my week the way he used to before any of this started. And those evenings are the actual reason I kept showing up 312 times. Not because I was building a case, but because some part of me has always believed that showing up quietly, consistently, without an audience, is simply what love looks like when nobody's counting. I've thought too about how close this entire misunderstanding came to simply calcifying into permanent family lore, the kind of story that gets repeated at gatherings for years, unquestioned, until it becomes indistinguishable from fact. If Fatima hadn't made that offhand comment about being part of the evening routine, I don't know that I would have ever thought to request the actual log, and Camille's version of events might have simply continued unchallenged indefinitely, not out of malice exactly, but out of the ordinary human tendency to believe the story that makes us feel better about our own choices. There's something sobering in that, the recognition that the truth sometimes needs a fairly specific, almost accidental prompt to surface at all, even when the actual evidence has been sitting in a filing cabinet the entire time, available to anyone who thought to ask. I wonder, sometimes, how many other families are quietly living inside a similarly rearranged version of events, never quite prompted to check the record before it hardens into the only story anyone remembers telling. I think about Camille sometimes, and I don't feel real anger toward her anymore, even after that lunch. I think she's carrying a genuine, difficult guilt about not being able to show up the way she wishes she could, given her life. And I think it was easier for her to redirect that guilt into a story where I was the one who'd failed him, rather than sit with the harder, more honest feeling of simply not having enough hours in her own week. I don't think that makes what she said at that lunch okay. I just think it makes it a little easier to understand. If you're watching this and you've ever done the quiet, consistent work of caring for someone, only to have someone else claim that work as their own, or worse, accuse you of not doing it at all, I want you to hear this, because I spent 2.5 years believing that quiet consistency spoke for itself, and I've learned it doesn't always, not until someone actually asks to see the record. Showing up quietly night after night with no audience and no credit is still showing up. Sometimes the truth is sitting in a sign-in sheet at a front desk somewhere, time-stamped and unglamorous, waiting patiently for the moment someone finally thinks to ask for it. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time you showed up for someone quietly and nobody noticed until it actually mattered. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a man whose siblings told their mother's estate attorney he'd never once called to check on her. The same week his phone records showed 406 calls over 3 years.